Kurt, we're going to put you right here, and I want to thank you for being willing to not only be our first person, but to come down from New York with Jill and help close out our 2019 year of first person, so thank you for that.
Okay, well, we're happy to do it.
Right. Kurt, Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933. You were just 6 years of age when you left Germany with your parents in 1936. Before we turn to your parents' decision to leave Germany and what that meant for you and your family, tell us first what you can about your family's life prior to Hitler coming to power and the Nazi Party taking control of Germany.
Well, my mother's family, as you mentioned, had lived in the area of Eilendorf for centuries. And first time when we went to the grave sites there, the Jewish cemetery, a very small Jewish cemetery, my great-great-grandfather was buried in that lot, so they had deep roots there in Germany. Mm-hmm. But my father, who was sort of an amateur at studying governments, he always wanted to know a lot about the governments that he lived under, including here in the United States. Came to the conclusion that if Hitler or the Nazis ever came to power, we'd have to leave. Mm-hmm. He had no idea how correct he was, really, though. But he just assumed, based on their policies and what they talked about and what happened, that would be the only possible.
So he was thinking about this really quite early.
Well, yes, he thought about it very early because he had a brother who had emigrated to the United States shortly before the First World War. And he had visited him several times, mm-hmm. and was very impressed by the United States. Mm-hmm. And he thought if he had to leave Germany, this is where he would go.
And we're going to talk more about the way that you eventually got here. Your father was a veteran in the German army.
Yes.
Of the First World War.
Yes.
What do you know about his service?
Well, he lived in Bavaria at that time, which is in southern Germany, mm-hmm. and there was still a king of Bavaria. And when my father was drafted, and they found he was a chef in his father's hotel, he was assigned to the staff of the king of Bavaria as to be one of the people in the kitchen. He said,
for the king of Bavaria?
Yes.
Okay.
And he said there was one thing about that. He said, we were never hungry.
I can imagine. Tell us a little bit about your mother.
My mother was also very much involved in my grandfather's meat business, mm-hmm. and so she worked she was a working mother, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I was looked after by a young woman who we later met in Germany again, for all the years that we were there, because my mother was working also.
So she was your nanny.
Yes, she was my nanny, and we did meet her again after all those years, which was.
Let's talk about amazing. That. You met her literally 60 years later, yes. I think, in Germany, and she was able to tell you some things that you hadn't known. What did she tell you about that time?
Well, she told us a little bit about the history of the family, and as she knew it, and that there was a good relationship within the community between the Jews and the other population. Mm-hmm. A small Jewish community, but it had survived
all those years.
As far as we can go, trace it back.
I think one of the things that you mentioned to me that she did tell you about, she remembered after Hitler came to power, the brown shirts started boycotting your family's businesses.
Yes, my mother was terribly disturbed by that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the things that influenced my father to make sure that he would get out as early as he could. But unfortunately, sometime after Hitler came to power, Uncle Max here in the United States had died. And my father had lost contact. The only contact he really had here in the States. Mm-hmm. So his plans of coming to the States if he left Germany, as the Irish poet said, something about what is it, about the wishes of I can't remember it now, but to the extent that the plans that we have can often just simply vanish.
And those plans had vanished at that point.
What happened, yes.
What was that period like from what you know, mostly from what your parents told you, between when Hitler came to power in 1933 and then the decision to leave and leaving in 1936?
Yes.
So you were there for the first 3 years of the Nazis being in complete control.
Yes. What happened, and I really only discovered a lot of the details after I came to the museum as a volunteer, and one day at the end of one of the history classes given by the staff here for the volunteers to teach them about the period that this museum is concerned with, he asked me, he said, "How did you get here?" And I told him that we went to Palestine in 1936, and he said, "You went under the agreement," which I didn't know anything about. It seems that the British, in that period, around 1936, when they were administering Palestine after the First World War, felt that if there was a larger Jewish population in Palestine, it would be good for the economy. And they made an agreement with the German government in Berlin, believe it or not, that they would allow German immigrants to Palestine to come under more favorable circumstances than if they came from somewhere else, trying to draw these people in. And I guess my father learned about that agreement. My mother had relatives in Palestine. In her family, there were some very ardent Zionists who had gone there, had nothing to do with Adolf Hitler. They went there to settle the land and create a Jewish presence in Palestine. And they also informed my parents of this agreement. So that's
how he was able to...
Gave him the incentive, and we were able to go there.
Before you left for Palestine, you started school. Do you have any recollections of what that period was like?
I did. I became 6, as you said, in March. Okay. And if I recall correctly, the school year started in the spring in Germany at that time. So I had to go to school because when I became 6, or shortly thereafter. And fortunately, there was a Jewish school in downtown Aachen, and I was able to take a trolley from where we lived into the city every day. My father was a little concerned about this little Jewish boy riding the trolley all alone, and sometimes he would follow the trolley with a bicycle to make sure nothing had happened. I didn't know that at that time, but because he didn't want to, me to worry or feel embarrassed that my father was following me to make sure I got there safely.
Which is probably why he didn't ride the tram with you. Instead, he just followed on a bicycle just to make sure you were safe.
That's right. He had some worries already then.
You had told me that you've always enjoyed education and went on to get a great education, but you were not happy going to school at that time.
No, I wasn't. Yeah. I don't know why. It was just a feeling.
Just a feeling.
I guess maybe the underlying unease of my parents somehow was transmitted to me. I don't know.
You're now 6 years old, and your father has been able to figure out a way to get out of Germany under this agreement, and you moved to Palestine. Tell us what you recall about leaving and what it was like for you because one of the things I meant to ask you earlier is how large of an extended family did you have? You had a lot of relatives.
Yes. And each of my parents had a surviving parent. My mother's father was living, and my father's mother was living. And that picture we saw at the beginning, where I'm standing in front of the fountain, was taken in the square that my grandmother lived on in Würzburg. We went to visit down there quite a few times before we left Germany. And my father tried to influence his mother, and there was a single sister still living with her, and others to go with us. And they didn't feel it was necessary somehow. I mean, I can understand that, families that had lived there for generations, it's difficult to pull up roots.
Right.
And these people, I guess, were hoping that this would blow over,
that Hitler wouldn't last, the Nazis wouldn't last that long. Yeah.
That's right.
So the rest of the family stayed behind.
Except for this cousin Walter.
Who went to the United States?
To Palestine. Who went to Palestine as well, earlier. That was it.
Even though I think your father was forced to close one of his stores under the Nazis, he was able to sell the butcher shop, and there's a really interesting story about who he sold it to. He sold the butcher shop, and
yes, later, after the war, at one of our trips to Germany, well, let's go back a little bit. One of the only surviving cousins that I had was the son of my mother's brother, Uncle Alfred, who had been a teacher of Jewish studies in Germany. And he was arrested on Kristallnacht and thrown into jail. And the only way he could get out, and this was the policy of the Germans when they did this, would be if they could demonstrate that they would leave Germany. The policy of the German government at that time was get the Jews out of Germany. So they made it as uncomfortable as possible and as dangerous as possible to encourage Jews to leave. And the only way he could have gotten out was if he could demonstrate leaving. So his wife started going around to the various consulates in their area to find a place where they could go, with very little success. But fortunately, she also had family in Palestine. And they encouraged her to come to Palestine, and this not with this agreement. Okay, by that time, that agreement was no longer
right. That was a short-term agreement.
Yes, yep. It was no longer in effect, and she had very little success of finding a place to go with her husband outside of Germany until these relatives in Palestine said, "Come here and we'll work with you." And what happened was they went to Palestine as visitors, a visitor's visa. Mm-hmm. And when that visa expired, these other relatives of theirs had found a place for them to hide, because the British came around looking for them to return to Germany.
Send them back to Germany.
Mm-hmm. So they were able, and then of course once the war started, they were not in danger of being sent back again.
Right.
So then they were able to come out sort of out of this shelter where they were hiding. And this cousin became a member of the Foreign Service of Israel later in his life as he grew up. That was his occupation. And he was assigned to Germany at one period, and he encouraged us to come at that time to visit them in Germany, and we would look around and about our history while he was assigned to this area. And that's what we did.
Is that when you went back and found that the people that you had sold the butcher shop to in 1936, same family owned it?
Yes.
When you went back?
Still owned it then.
60-some years later.
Yes.
And what? And they shared some things with you. I think they, if I remember right, the grandson or the son of the person who bought the shop from you,
yes,
remembered your grandfather.
Yes, yes. And they said that when my grandfather was picked up by the Nazis, all the Jewish men and elderly men, particularly, and women, were sent to the Jewish old age home in Aachen as a place. They had sort of gathered these people there, and they said, since they were not too well treated there, he would come from time to time if he could. Mm-hmm. To see to ask for food there at his old shop, in his old house.
He'd go to his
and they
old
would
shop.
bring him in, and they said to feed him because they felt very sorry. He said, which was very dangerous for them as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, of course, a very sad story to hear.
What happened to that grandfather?
Well, he was sent to Theresienstadt,
Mm-hmm.
Terezin, and from there to a death camp sometime later. I mean, this was something that was on the records.
Right. You found this out.
And my grandmother,
Mm-hmm.
who for some reason had been shipped up by the Nazis from Würzburg to Aachen and gathered there mm-hmm. in the same old age home, died in Theresienstadt.
You shared with me, Kurt, that one of your earliest memories, I believe, was saying goodbye to your grandmother.
Yes.
Because they weren't going to go with you to Palestine.
As you could see in that picture.
Yeah. What do you remember about saying goodbye to her?
I don't know. It was, of course, I was too young to understand fully what was going on.
Right, of course.
But I remember the long conversations my father had with his mother and sister about possibly joining us. And we have a picture that we donated here to the museum as well of her and the daughter during, well, I guess it was before the war started, but already when the Nazis had been in power, and the picture shows them standing in front of a building, and the building is I don't know what the building was, but it was hung with the swastika flags, mm-hmm. And it was kind of eerie to see that.
You see your grandparents in front of that.
And we know, and then what happened to her, of course.
So they both went to Theresienstadt. Yeah.
Yes.
You went to Palestine. What do you remember about going to Palestine, how you got there?
Well, a little boy on board of a ship. He'd never been there on a ship before.
Yeah.
It was very exciting. And of course, I didn't know really
The
why we
reasons why
were
you were
going to
going,
Palestine at that point. And it was kind of a fun thing. Of course, when I got to Palestine, I had to go to school. And of course, I didn't speak a word of Hebrew, of modern Hebrew. And I came home for a first few weeks crying. I couldn't understand the teacher. But at that age, you learn languages very quickly, and children adjust very quickly. And I felt very comfortable after a while. And it was, the worries were with my family. I didn't have any worries.
And for your family, your father had owned businesses in Germany. When they got to Palestine, how did they earn a living?
Well, as we said earlier, you mentioned he went into the trucking business with his nephew, Walter. In fact, before he left Germany, he had been corresponding with Walter about what he could do. He knew he wasn't going to be able to open up a restaurant or something like that because you couldn't take any money out of Germany. So whatever, he had to do something there earlier, and perhaps what it might be.
So that was an important point you just made. When they left Germany, they were allowed to go. They could go at that time, but you could take no money with you.
That's right. You couldn't take any money.
Okay.
Meanwhile, he had written to Walter about that problem. What was he going to do in Germany? And Walter had said something about, well, the trucking business here might, he wanted to go into the trucking business. And Walter, he thought that was a business that he could make money in because there was always a need for that. And my father was able to send a truck from Germany to Palestine, which was another good thing because he was able to use his money to buy something and ship it out of the country.
As opposed to taking it with him, he could do that.
That's right. And the Germans were only too happy. Jews usually have to pay more for the goods than other people if they needed it. So
I don't know if it was the case at that time, but I know this affected your wife's family. When Jews were able to leave, when they left, they could take goods with them, not money, as you said. Yes. They could take goods.
Yes, we did.
But they were taxed at 100%.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I don't know exactly the details. But they essentially had to leave. They went left with very little money. And that also, of course, made it a little tougher than when they got there. Mm-hmm. But they did go into the trucking business.
They did go into the trucking business.
I can remember they sometimes take me along when I was on vacation or something. And if they were carrying, let's say, soft drinks, sometimes, they'd stop and I'd get a soft drink to drink, which was a big thing for a little boy of that age.
And I think as they were trying to get the trucking business going, you'd shared with me that they also took in boarders in your house. You opened up a little restaurant in the house.
That's right, they did. My father, they had one day a week where they would be able to, they had people who would come in to eat there because the cooking was very good. Mm-hmm. And that was a way of making money.
But you didn't stay there long, 2.5 years. 2.5 years. So in 1938, you immigrated to the United States.
Yes. What happened was Uncle Max had died, yes, and we had no contact.
So you're one relative.
But my Aunt Julia, who was married to another brother of my father's, Uncle Theodore, had family in the States, a brother who had emigrated to the United States very early, had nothing to do with Adolf Hitler. I had settled, gone into business in the Cincinnati area, and married as he learned about what was happening in Germany, he thought it was best to bring his sisters out of the country and have them come to the States. So he had 3 sisters, besides 2 other sisters and their families besides my Aunt Julia, his 3rd sister. And he brought the 3 sisters and their families to the States, so now we had somebody there. And my father wrote to his brother, see if he could find someone to sponsor us in the family that he had just married into. And there was someone who was willing to do that. And that's how we got to the States.
And in order to get here, of course, you had to be able to get visas and have somebody sponsor you, and you had family members to sponsor you, but you also had to be able to come in under a quota of different nationalities.
Right. After the First World War, the United States immigration policies had changed drastically. And the quotas were set up for every country, I guess, basically in the world, as to how many people from that country could come to the United States at any given year. And of course, in Germany, the Jews had tried to get visas to come to the United States, and those who were, so very quickly, the quotas in Germany for people coming to the United States were filled very quickly.
Right, so it was very difficult.
And besides, as I said, at that immediate time, we didn't have anyone here even to do this. But after 2 years, one of the advantages the British also gave these immigrants from Germany is after 2 years they became citizens of Palestine. And that was something because the citizenship of Germany had been taken away from them by the Nazis. They were without a country, so to speak.
They were stateless, what we call stateless.
Exactly.
They were stateless.
So the problem of emigrating was getting very fuzzy as to how, and it was, to come to the States from Germany became almost impossible for most people.
So they were able to come under a Palestinian quota.
Exactly. Yeah. The quota for Palestine was a very small quota. I mean, very few, because Palestine is a very small country, not that many people. But it was undersubscribed. People weren't streaming from Palestine to come to the United States. So it was undersubscribed, and as Palestinian citizens, we could come in under the Palestinian quota. And if you look at my naturalization papers and those of my parents, where it says previous nationality, it says Palestinian.
Yep. Despite centuries of having been in Germany. What do you remember about coming to the United States?
Well, it was December when we came. And I remember it was very cold in New York when we landed. Mm-hmm. And I was fascinated. New York was an amazing city. And, but of course we were heading for Cincinnati. But my parents were able, we couldn't just get off the boat and take the train to Cincinnati. Right. My father, I think, they were rather exhausted from the whole affair. And so we stayed in New York for 2 days, and then and then took a train. Actually, it was more than 2 days. I can't remember the exact number. It was a little more than that. And then we headed for Cincinnati by train.
So here, in the span of a little over 2 years, your family has made 2 major moves from Germany to Palestine, Palestine to the U.S., moving to, in both cases, entirely different
And
cultures.
my father was broke.
Pardon?
My father was broke.
And he was
He
broke.
had spent the last money he had for the trip to the States.
And when you came here, it was the Depression.
Yes.
So here you are, your father's broke, it's the Depression, you're now in Cincinnati. What happened?
Yes. And so my father wanted to find some work, and he had studied English in Germany because he thought it would be a good idea to have that. So he was able to get about in as far as language was concerned. But he had a lot of trouble finding work because of the Depression. And he was an immigrant.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow, I don't know exactly, he did get a job in a very large cafeteria operation where all he did was prepare the vegetables for the kitchen.
And we neglected to say earlier, I think, that your father had actually trained as a chef in Switzerland, right? Early in his life.
Yes.
So
He was a trained cook and chef.
Yeah, but here he is preparing
And
vegetables.
he said one of the advantages was he used to say of the work he had, he said he always had a seat alone on the trolley because he smelled so of onions that nobody would sit next to him. So when he came home, he always had a seat to himself in the trolley. And one day he's going to work, and somebody calls out his name.
On the streets of Cincinnati.
On the streets of Cincinnati, Hugo. He turns around, and here's this man, and he was a man he had trained with, as you said, in Switzerland when he was learning his profession and his occupation in Switzerland. This man was there as well, learning to be a cook and chef. And he was now a chef at one of the large downtown hotels in Cincinnati. And here, so my father, he says, "What are you doing here, Hugo?" And my father tells him his tale of woe about having to leave Germany and so forth and so on. And he says, "And what are you doing?" And he explains it to him, and he says, "What a terrible waste of talent," he says. "Meet me in the union offices next Tuesday." He says, "I'll see that you get a job." And he did.
He did.
And my father got a job as a cook at a restaurant in downtown Cincinnati run by two Jewish brothers who needed a cook at that moment. And he very quickly became the chef because he was very talented in his occupation. And he spent the next years during the war cooking in downtown Cincinnati. And of course that made life a lot easier for everybody.
And as he was doing that, of course, your mother was, trying to contribute to the income of the family. What did your mother do?
Well, my mother started going around cleaning. As a cleaning woman, it was hard to find work for women as well. To start that way, bringing some money in, and there were weeks when she made more money than my father had when he was working with the vegetables.
Mm-hmm. And you also took in some boarders again in the house.
We rented a house in the same building that Uncle Theodore lived, and Aunt Julia. And it was an older apartment house. It had very large apartments, 3 bedrooms, dining room, and a kitchen with a butler's pantry and so forth. And they rented the 3 bedrooms out, and we used the dining room as the bedroom, and I slept in that bedroom as well, until things got a little easier, and gradually we got rid of one renter after the other, and we were able to afford the apartment.
You shared with me that as a kid, with these boarders, you would, sit and listen to what they had to say or talk to them over the dinner because you ate together.
Yes.
And this really stuck with me, that one of the boarders was a lady whose husband had been a drummer in the Civil War.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
I mean, that was just amazing to me.
It's a show, yes.
Yeah.
He was a drummer boy of the Civil War, he told us.
When you finally came here to Cincinnati, you were, I think, about 8.5.
Yes.
What'd you do from an education standpoint? You had to go
Well,
to
of
school.
course, that was the question. I didn't speak a word of English.
Right.
But at that age, so they put me in the first grade to learn English.
So you were in with all the first graders.
Yes, and fortunately there was a little boy in the first grade who came from a home that was bilingual as well, and they spoke German. So he was my translator.
And he was a real first grader.
Yes,
he was your
he was a
translator.
real first grader. And they moved me up then to the second and third grade as I learned English. And I was about 1 year behind, actually, finally, which I made up when I went to high school, the high school I went to was from 7 through 12, and I would go to summer school and take a needed course. And so that by the time I'd done that for a few years, I still was able to graduate at 18 from the
on
high
age,
school
right?
by doing that. So by the time my parents moved, which was that year, 48, I had finished high school.
During that period, you had left Germany in 1936 to Palestine, United States in 1938, and then here through the war years. Were your parents able to maintain contact at all with family members in Germany for any period of that time?
Very little. At first, there were these cards that sometimes the Red Cross was able to be allowed by the Germans to have people fill out and send to relatives abroad. And so there was a little contact. And then, of course, that ceased when the war started, or shortly thereafter. And I think we've discussed it before. During the war, of course, you didn't really know what was going on in Germany. And my parents had hopes that maybe some people, their relations would survive the war. And of course, when the war was over, we found out that hadn't occurred very much. I had one living first cousin who was in Palestine, with my mother's brother's son, whom we're, of course, still in touch with now. And another cousin on my mother's side who had gone to Belgium from Germany to avoid the Nazis and was able to hide her daughter in a convent in Belgium when the Nazis
when they invaded Belgium.
Invaded Belgium. And that girl survived the war, and her mother survived the war. And so those are the only real relatives that I had, except the family that we had in Palestine.
So the rest of the family, the extended family?
Essentially, was gone.
When did you find that all out?
Well, of course, it was my parents who did. I know there was work through the Red Cross, and
this was after the war.
After the war, and of course the question of if people did survive and were looking for relatives, there were postings of those names and so forth, but there were really nobody that we had as relatives besides the ones that, like the girl in Belgium, and my cousin who had was living in Palestine, And those relatives, and my mother's other relatives in Palestine, were really the only people left.
Were you?
And it was terrible for my parents.
That's what I was going to ask.
Because, I didn't know these people really that well. I'd been 6 years old when we left Germany.
Right.
So, but for them, to lose all these people.
And their parents.
Yes, it was very difficult for them to get over that. We weren't the only people who
right, of course,
were in that situation.
But it was, when you and I first met, you told me it was just terribly traumatic for your parents when they finally understood what had really happened. 1947, I think the family picks up stakes again and moves to...
Well, 48, actually.
48
yes.
to New Jersey.
Yes, they had friends in New Jersey that talked them into moving to New Jersey. My father wanted to retire, and he was no longer cooking. He had, some years earlier, he had gone into a business establishing a bakery with an acquaintance who was a baker as well. And my father knew about baking quite a bit because in order to become a chef, you had to know a lot about baking. And it was cheaper to open a bakery than it was a restaurant. So he went into business with this acquaintance. And they didn't get along too well, as it turned out. So as he got older, he decided maybe he would retire to the chicken farm, which would provide him some income, additional income, when he retired, if he left there, so that in his retirement he would be able to live off what assets he had plus the chicken farm.
Plus the chicken farm.
And we moved to Vineland, New Jersey.
And it wasn't long after that, when you got out of high school, you got drafted into the Army.
Yes. Well, shortly, that happened very quickly. Yes, shortly. In Cincinnati, I would have gone to the University of Cincinnati because it was very inexpensive for residents of the city to go to that university. I mean, it was something that was easy to handled. Unless you were really in poverty. So I would have done that, but now I was now in New Jersey, and although New Jersey has a state university, it wasn't as liberal with its residents as the University of Cincinnati. I think Cincinnati University had more assets. So they were able to offer this very cheap rate for the residents. So I decided I'd have to go to work to earn some money to be able to go to university after that. And I went to work for the local newspaper in the advertising department, starting at the bottom. I used to take the ads to the merchants to have them look at, to see that everything was correct before they were run in the paper and so forth. These people were very good to me. They wanted me to learn the advertising business, in the newspaper advertising business. And within a couple of years, and I saved up a bit of money, and then, of course, I was drafted. And the Korean War was on. And I was sent to Arkansas. Fort Chaffee was the name of the... Well, now it's Fort Chaffee. Then it was Camp Chaffee.
Camp Chaffee then, yep.
For my training, and it was artillery training in that camp. And I decided... I knew where we were going after basic. There was no question about it. But there were some alternatives in the military. And two of us in the company were accepted to the alternatives we had selected. I had selected OCS as an alternative immediately.
Officer Candidate School.
Right, Officers Candidate School. But of course, once I graduated from there, I knew where I was going, and that was what it. But still, there was a delay, and I figured this war's got to be over sometime.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it had been on for a while. And so I took my basic training, and when I finished the basic training, I had been accepted to OCS. But it was 7 weeks later for my class to start. So the Army doesn't let you sit around for 7 weeks doing nothing. So they sent me to something called leadership school, which was for people who were becoming non-commissioned officers. And they said, it's really very good for you, and it was. I lost all the excess weight I gained from the poor cooking in basic training, because we were a very active group there in the leadership school. And as you mentioned earlier, I had an accident.
Yes. A very serious accident.
And this was I finished the preliminary leadership school. I was in what was advanced leadership school. And we were setting up a 105 Howitzer battery one day. We were helping the people who were training all these trainees coming in, so we could see how they operated, and that's how you learn what you had to do when you were a non-commissioned officer. And so we were setting up a 105 Howitzer battery, and we were a man short in our group, because they had counted off, and you needed 6 people to move a howitzer. That was what the regulations were. And we only had 5 left. And the guy said, well, you'll be able to manage with 5. So we were moving the howitzers in position, and I tripped over a rock. It's a very rocky area where we set up these howitzers. And I fell forward, and the guy in back of me was being carried forward by the howitzer, and there's a man on the other side also being carried. And so he let go, I mean, he didn't even think, it was just a reaction, a knee-jerk reaction. And he let go, and I only left one man holding the trails of a howitzer. He couldn't hold it, and it fell on my foot. Fortunately, I'd fallen in a way, so it fell across the sole of my boot, not across the top of the boot, where it would have cut my foot off. Right. But it turned out it had a lot of fractures in that foot. I didn't lose my foot, but it was in bad shape. But you have to be lucky in things, and I was lucky again here. That hospital turned out to be the orthopedic center for the Army Medical Corps for the southwestern United States. And they had divided the country up into sections, about 4 or 5, so that returning wounded from Korea could be sent to a hospital that was at least a little closer to their home. So if they were from New Mexico, they weren't going to be sent to a place in Maine, maybe, or something. So this base hospital had been designated as the orthopedic center for the southwestern United States. And so I was lucky. I mean,
you got the best surgical care they could offer.
90% of the doctors were orthopedic surgeons, and they fixed up my foot.
And then when you recovered, you were discharged.
Well, it was long, very long before that. But I got a lot of leave time, because once they have a cast on your foot, what are they going to do with you? So for my first cast, and I had 6 pins in my foot, all the way through my foot, because all these pieces had to grow back together again. And they were excellent surgeons. And the doctor says, well, we can't do much for you right now for a while. He says, why don't you go home? He says, we'll give you a 30-day leave.
You're out of there.
And while I was in the hospital, changing my problems, and it was healing, I got 3 30-day leaves.
3 30-day leaves.
And my 3.5 really. I got a 2-week leave too. So in all that time, I was home a great deal, which was a great joy to my parents. And then when I came out of finished, and the hospital was ready to discharge me, I had to go to the personnel section in the hospital, and this major was supposed to assign me to something. And he looked at me and he looked at my records and he said, it says here no marching, it says no carrying heavy weights, no standing for long periods of time. He says, what am I going to do? But the Korean War was still on. And the policy was, don't let people out of the army early. He says, finally, after he made a few phone calls, he says, can you type? Yeah. I had taught myself to type between my junior and senior year in high school. I said, yeah, I can type. He said, well, you got to be better than the guy I'm going to be replacing. You're going to be replacing, he says. I'm sending him to Korea. I went down, reported to the Medical Holding Detachment headquarters. Medical Holding Detachment is the unit all the patients are assigned to. Mm-hmm. It's a big bookkeeping job. And a lot of filing to do. And I became a clerk typist.
And then, of course, when you finally did leave the Army, you had the GI Bill, went on to the Wharton School of Business, and a very successful career.
Yes, thank you. But all the way, the Army wasn't ready to release me yet. They had a program at the base. It was called the Soldier of the Month. And every unit selected a Soldier of the Month, including the Hospital Medical Holding Detachment. And if you were selected, you got $75 and a weekend pass. So I was selected once. I mean, we had to. There were very few people who were qualified to be Soldier of the Month in that organization. Everybody had been there already. And I was selected from this unit. And I went, one of the things that you had to do there was, you got an interview with the commanding general of the base. I went and reported to the office of the commanding general, and I see this major who's obviously an assistant to the general. He had my personnel file on his desk. And he says, oh, he says, Pauly. He says, what happened to you? What happened to you? I see here you were a candidate for Officers Candidate School. So you still interested? And I said, no, sir. I said, I don't think I could do it physically. It would be too hard for me now. I mean, I didn't want to insult the man and say, I don't want to be an officer. He thought he was doing me a big favor, but I assured him. Then I got my interview with the commanding general, who kept calling me son. And that was it.
That was it?
And then I stayed in until my time was up. I was 2 years in the Army, and as you said, I went to Penn.
Quite a saga, that one.
So, it worked out.
Yep.
People ask me about how did I manage to go to an Ivy League school. I always say my rich uncle paid. Uncle Sam.
Uncle Sam. I think we are at the close of our program, so we're not going to have time for you to ask Kurt some questions from the audience, but I'm going to turn back to Kurt in just a couple of moments to close our program. When he's finished, two things are going to happen. Sarah, our photographer, is going to come up on the stage and take a photograph of Kurt with you as the background, so please stay for that because that makes a nice memento. Then Kurt will remain on the stage, and we invite anybody who would like to come up on stage and ask him the question you didn't get to ask him. Just shake his hand, get a picture taken with him, whatever you want to do. So he'll stay behind for that, for anybody who'd like to come up and talk to him. I want to thank you all for being here. Today, this closes our 2019 year of First Person. We'll resume again in 2020 in March, in the spring of 2020, so we hope that you'll come back. All of our programs, we had 44 of them this year. All of them are up on the YouTube channel of the museum, so they can be viewed. So we invite you back either virtually or to come back in person. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person gets the last word. And so our last word of the year, Kurt Pauly.
Should I go over there?
No, it's right here if you want. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Well, when I look back on my life, I think I was a very lucky person that I'm here, because if my parents hadn't been anxious to get out of Germany and made it out of Germany, I wouldn't be here. I'm quite convinced of that.
Mm-hmm.
No question about it. And unfortunately, we lost a lot of family. And my parents were really shocked after the war. It was very difficult for them to comprehend. When the war was on, there was always a chance of hope. At the very beginning of the war, there was even some correspondence with relatives through the Red Cross and so forth. And as the war progressed, of course, you lost touch. But they and a lot of other people really had hope that they didn't really know how bad it was. They knew it was bad, but they really didn't know how bad it was. And when they discovered what it was, my mother always hoped that maybe one of her nephews would survive. And besides this one girl who was in Belgium, nobody. And so I consider myself very lucky. The country's been very good to me, and I hope I've done a little bit for them. But it was a terrible shock, more so for my parents than for me. But these people were strangers to me in a way. And of course, when you're that age, you just grow up, you make friends, you do your thing. I was busy, went to school, that kept me busy, met my wife, and we were attracted to each other, and had this very similar background in some ways. Mm-hmm. And that helped my parents a bit too. They got another family that they could be related to. So that's really all to say. I was just very lucky.
Very lucky. Thank you.